Order, order. Moving on now, Sir David Amess to move the motion.
Mrs Gillen, I beg to move the motion standing in my name as on the order paper.
The question is that this House has considered 5 safety measures in school buildings. Sir David Amess.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity that I have to raise this subject, and I promise not to start to beat the Minister up immediately. But as with so many of these debates, to me this is such a simple, straightforward issue. I'm absolutely puzzled why it has not been dealt with over the last couple of decades. Because at the heart of it all, the House either does or doesn't think that having sprinkler systems will help to save people's lives. That, to me, is the issue. And I would have thought, looking at all the evidence, that it is quite clear that the House has come to a conclusion that it makes good common sense that all schools have sprinkler systems fitted. So, in short, Mrs Gillen, I have to say to my honourable friend, the Minister, who I have the highest regard for, I simply do not understand, given that the government has the power to give money for new schools to be built, surely it's not going to take Einstein to come up with a plan whereby you can't tender for the contract unless it is a part of the contract that there is a sprinkler system contained in the new build project. This is quite a simple matter. And our noble friend, Lord Nash, in the other place, of course, I do have correspondence from him with this issue, and it's wonderful that all sorts of consultations are going to take place. But I have to say to my honourable friend, the Minister, I will not shut up on this issue until I get the straightforward answer that future contracts will only be awarded to builders who insist that sprinkler systems are installed. Now, I had the great pleasure, Mrs Gillen, of being the chairman of the Fire Rescue and Safety All-Party Parliamentary Group. Indeed, I was in the last Parliament. And looking at my honourable friend from Basildon, when I had the privilege of being the Member of Parliament for Basildon, I can think of 3 particular incidents which made me admire the wonderful work that our fire service do. On 2 occasions, our local fire service attended incidents where small children died, and the emotional effect that that has on our firefighters is beyond most of us to understand. One was sadly in Long Riding, which I think is still in the area represented by my honourable friend. A gentleman who was running a takeaway Chinese restaurant came in to find that his wife, who had mental health problems, had smothered their 5 children. Now, that's nothing to do with fire, but it was the fire service who attended that matter. But just tragically, in what used to be Barnstable School, a number of children got locked in a shed in the grounds, must have been playing with matches, and as a result of it, a fire took place and they lost their lives. And that was a tragic funeral I will never forget attending at St Martin's, which my honourable friend is only too well aware of. And then irony of all ironies, Mrs Gillen, I can't remember which election it was that I was canvassing in, I think it was 1987 it must have been 1987, and canvassing in part of the Nethermain, the rural bit of the constituency, and knocked on the door where a rather dishevelled gentleman came to the door who seemed to be slightly not entirely with it, I'll put it like that. We moved next door to the property. Well, unbeknown to me, he was carrying a bowl of paraffin, and the next minute, we're standing talking to the neighbour, he went up. And then after that election result, that was the first funeral that I attended. And again, I went into a state of shock, and I saw how our firefighters dealt with that situation, and unfortunately in those days I used to perhaps drag along one or two of my children to canvass with me. I never did that again. So I just wanted to say to my honourable friend the Minister, I know this isn't his brief, but all of us have great regard for the work that our firefighters do, and at first hand I've got the experience of the way they dealt with the tragedy of children being killed. So, Mrs Gillen, I would like to thank the Fire Sector Federation, the Chief Fire Officers Association, Zurich Municipal Insurance and the National Fire Sprinkler Network for providing me with the necessary evidence and information on school fires, which I've drawn on in terms of my contribution to this debate. And I would like to remind the House that yesterday was National Burn Awareness Day. Now, when I first became a Member of Parliament, we never had these specific days, we never all wore these ribbons, but once AIDS adopted the red ribbon, of course, every day of the week there is a national day. And it is tragic. I mean, if I'd have had the opportunities at Prime Minister's Question Time, that is the point that I would have raised. Unfortunately, it got no media coverage, which is a great shame. And it was, Mrs Gillen, for that reason that the All-Party Parliamentary Group actually put in for this debate. And I want to praise the work of the Children's Burns Trust. And I know that next February there will be a National Sprinkler Day awareness, which I hope we'll be able to get some little bit more profile than we seem to have thus far. I would like to assure the Children's Burn Trust that although their day yesterday went by without great attention, that many members of the House are going to continue to raise issues that we feel very strongly on. I and many members of the group who are present here today are, as I've said already, very frustrated that this issue, which is very simple, I can't see the cost of the government in this, has not been dealt with, whether it be by, I can't yet blame the present government, but whether, well, no, I won't. It's a little bit too soon, but the coalition government, which obviously my party was a supporter of and was the lead in, and the previous Labour government. I just don't understand why it hasn't been dealt with. But I'm sure the Minister will have the answer to why we haven't taken action on it. Many members of our all-party parliamentary group were very surprised to hear that since 2010 there has actually been a decline in the number of new schools and academies being installed with automatic sprinkler systems. I mean, this is crazy. How on earth could there be a decline? But there has actually been a decline. And the reason that members of the all-party parliamentary group were so surprised is because in 2007, when our then Right Honourable friend, who is now the Noble Lord Howard of Lympney, he, in his constituency, Lympney Primary School, on the 13th of September 2006, suffered a tragic fire. The fire started as a consequence of an electrical fault above the staff room in the school, and this happened at the start of the day in the morning. As the Chief Fire Officer who was responsible for leading the efforts of the fire services to extinguish the fire at Lympney Primary School said at the time, if the school had been fitted with a properly designed and installed sprinkler system, the fire may have been controlled, if not extinguished, in its very early stage. Instead, Mrs Gillen, the school was completely destroyed. Thankfully, no lives were actually lost as a consequence of there being no such system in place. So why, after all these years, have successive governments failed to put in place even a framework or a strategy or whatever the buzzword is with the civil servants in the Department of Education? Why is it that we haven't done anything to make sure that such a tragedy never, ever happens again? The response may be, from my honourable friend, that this tragedy in 2006 was an isolated incident, and some may ask why waste valuable public expenditure on infrequent events. Well, Mrs. Gillan, how can you put a price on one life? And that is the point, the very simple point I wish to make. There is evidence to suggest that this was not an isolated incident. And I personally believe that safety and security of our children should be ensured irrespective of the actual cost, especially when considering refurbishing or rebuilding schools following a severe fire. It can be very, very expensive. Now, the most recent statistics provided for me by Zurich Municipal show that £58 million was spent on school rebuilds following the fire damage in 2009. £58 million. The last year for which the Department for Communities and Local Government has cost figures, and again, Mrs. Gillan, I don't understand this, the latest figures I could get were 2004, when, I mean, crazy, 11 years ago, when 1,229 fires were estimated to cost around £52 million. But why we don't have more up-to-date figures, I don't understand. Following the fire at Lympney Primary School, it was a welcome relief that Kent County Council, now I'm an Essex member, we just look over the River Thames at Kent, but I'm going to praise them. They confirmed that the rebuild would include the installation of a fire sprinkler system. But why must we be reactive? We as legislators should attempt to preempt such incidents, and I want the government, which I support, now that we've got a majority government, we can't blame things that go wrong on the Liberal Party. We've got a majority. Now, I want us to do something positive and good with the majority that we have, and I want us to be proactive rather than reactive. Now, although there were no fatalities as a result of the fire at Lympney, and there have been no fatalities across England as a result of school fires, we just can't sit back on our laurels and be complacent. A tragedy could happen. And I think it's within the government's gift to make sure that we never have a tragic incident by insisting that when contracts are signed, there must be a sprinkler system installed. And this is not party political, my goodness. We had representatives in the House today from the Scottish National Party, from my own party, the Conservatives, obviously from the Labour Party. I think with only 8 Liberals, it's probably a bit difficult for them to service all committees, but I know they very much agree with the point that I wish to make. And what is frustrating is that since 2007, when the former member for Folkestone and Hythe brought this issue to the House's attention, the situation has got worse. So, from April 2007 to May 2010, an estimated 70% of new schools and academies built were installed with automatic fire sprinklers. Room for improvement, but basically on the right track. However, since May 2010, the number of new schools built with automatic fire sprinklers systems has plummeted to 35%. It's actually been halved. Now, this is absolutely, totally unacceptable. The figures show that 65% of the new builds are without fire sprinkler systems. This is incredibly disappointing, given the commitment that successive governments have made to improve the situation. So I say to my honourable friend, in a recent statement by the Secretary of State for Education, who I genuinely have the highest regard for, she said, in line with departmental guidance, the specification does not make the fitting of sprinklers mandatory, but does suggest instances where their installation could be beneficial. Well, I say to the government, let's make it mandatory. It's no good us complacently saying it isn't mandatory at the moment. Let's do something about it. It could be taken through the House if any time needed to be spent on it immediately. And all political parties would agree that it should be mandatory. And I think this statement that my right honourable friend made is some way away, really, from the cross-party commitment in 2007. I made a reference in my speech earlier to the cost benefit of mandatory installation, which granted cannot be ignored. As a Conservative, I'm very sympathetic to the challenges that the Exchequer faces. However, when it comes to fire safety costs, they are not merely financial, and we must look at the long-term implications that mandatory installation of fire sprinklers will have across the country. Because, of course, many of our schools, it's not just our children attending them during the day, the schools are rented out to all sorts of organisations to increase revenue. I would also, Mrs Gillan, like to make the point to the House. I contacted my own local authority in Southend to find out the number of schools in my constituency where sprinkler systems are installed. And they sent me back this email to say that the schools in Southend do not have to itemise whether they have sprinkler systems installed. So they don't have any information whatsoever, according to my local authority, on whether or not our schools have sprinkler systems. Well, I say, come on, local authority. There aren't that many schools in Southend. Someone could sit there and phone them up and ask the chairman of the governing body, do you have or do you not have a sprinkler system? So to me, that is an absolutely pathetic response. And if other members are getting those responses throughout the country, shame on them, frankly. The chief executive should say we could do far better than that. I'm told by the House of Commons Library, and the House of Commons Library is fantastic. I regard them as the fountain of all truth, Mrs Gillan. And they have told me that information is not collected centrally. Well, I don't know why that is, and that local authorities are, as I say, not obliged to collect this data. Well, they may not be obliged, but I think they should collect this data. And I praise Kent County Council for the action in terms of the data collection on what they did after the fire. Between the years 2001 and 2003, apparently in Kent there were 125 recorded fires, and in 2011 to 2013 that had plummeted to 41. So Kent is actually doing much better than other areas on this issue. It's a fall of approximately 66%, with 7 school building fires in 2013. It's 7 too many, but at least it's a fall. Now, these figures show that through local cooperation and a sensible policy, the number of fires can be significantly reduced. So, in conclusion, Mrs Gillan, I call on the government to recognise the positive benefits of having an approach like that of Kent County Council and Kent and Medway Fire Authority. I also take note of the letter that I received from the Noble Lord Nash, and I would very much like to have a meeting with my honourable friend, together with other members of the all-party parliamentary group, to discuss this issue in more detail. Now, the Noble Lord Nash tells me that a consultation on the government's version of Building Bulletin 100, entitled Designing for Fire Safety in Schools, will begin towards the end of this year. Well, we can have all the consultations in the world. It's just like this rubbish from about obesity that was going on this week with Jamie Oliver turning up at the House of Commons as if obesity has just been invented. It was my idea 10 years ago to have an inquiry when I was on the Health Select Committee into obesity, and if all our recommendations had been followed there, we wouldn't have to have all this business about sugar tax, fat tax and all the rest of it. The longer that I am a Member of Parliament, I'm yet hearing anything that's original. My frustration is that honourable members make good ideas, good suggestions, and nothing whatsoever is done about it. And I think if Parliament is worth anything, it's up to honourable members to hold the government or the executive to account to make sure that these good ideas are acted on. In March 2007, a commitment was made by the then Minister, former member for South Dorset, Jim Knight, who is now Lord Knight of Weymouth, that all new schools and academies built, and I quote, would be expected to have automatic sprinklers installed, except for a few low-risk schools. Well, I don't quite know how we define low-risk schools, but anyway, it was a great commitment, and of course the then government had 3 years to run. With figures showing that only 35% of new schools are fitted with sprinklers, I hope the government will use the impetus of a fresh election victory to do something about this. I think we have the power to ensure that fewer fires occur in schools across our country. That means that fewer people in harm's way, fewer costs if a refurbishment or rebuild is required, and fewer worries, dare I say, for the government. So I do hope my honourable friend will respond positively to the point which I have managed to talk for 20 minutes on, the simple one that I think it should be a requirement of all new building contracts awarded in terms of new build projects for schools, that they don't get the project unless it includes a requirement for a sprinkler system to be fitted.
The question